Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased because today we get to welcome back an author who I was lucky enough to interview about his previous book, and he's now back to tell us about his newest book titled State of Silence, the Espionage Act and the Rise of America's Secrecy Regime, published in 2023 from Basic Books. This book does pretty much what it says, explains the Espionage Act, which is weird, to be honest. This is a law that I knew some about, but learned a lot more about from this book, and think that it is a fascinating history, not just about this law, but about a whole big, broader question about secrecy in American politics and much more. So thank you so much for coming back, Dr. Sam Lebovic.
Thanks so much for having me.
Before we get into all things espionage, would you mind introducing yourself to listeners who may not have heard you last time you were here and explain why you decided that this would be your book project?
Sure. So I teach history at George Mason University, and I've written a couple of books exploring different aspects of the relationship between American press freedom, civil liberties, foreign relations, and the American public sphere. And the project sort of broadly that unites all of my work is an interest in thinking about how information and ideas circulate and sometimes don't circulate in the American public sphere and what that can tell us about American democracy. And so one of the big themes that came out of my first book, Free Speech and Unfree News, which was published by Harvard in 2016, which was an exploration of how the right to free speech doesn't really produce a democratic press in the 20th century because there are unanticipated problems, one of which was the rise of kind of corporate media consolidation, and the First Amendment isn't very helpful there. And the other problem the First Amendment turns out not to be very helpful with is the rise of state secrecy. And so I'd explored that problem a little through the history of the press and press freedom, and thought I was kind of done with that had touched on parts of the history of the Espionage Act. But then after that book came out, I was invited to join a group working on the history of national security whistleblowing that Hannah Gurman and Caton Mystery had put together. And, in a series of workshops and then in an edited volume they brought out called Whistleblowing Nation, I wrote a sort of early history of the Espionage Act and how it sort of evolved in the years between World War I and World War II, which was a history I knew very little about and not much had been written about. And that made me realize that there was a broader history of the Espionage Act to be told. And then a little bit of sort of good fortune came my way, which was that an editor at Basic Books actually got in touch and said they were interested in commissioning a narrative history of the Espionage Act over its entire history. And that fit pretty well with the themes I was interested in, and I had done some work already on the subject. And then, to be honest, that email came in about March of 2020. And so other plans I might have had about doing kind of more archival new research based in the archives far-flung really were put on hold during the early pandemic. And this was a project that made a lot of sense to kind of dig in and work further on material I already had at hand.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense, how that all comes together, both practically and in terms of your existing research. So I'd like to start sort of chronologically, right at the kind of pre-life, I suppose, of the Espionage Act, because something I think we're probably much more aware of in literature, especially around American history, is that narratives of kind of it all being about democracy and happy days is not necessarily the full story, and that there's a bunch of imperial history that is relevant in the United States if we go back to the late 19th and early 20th century. So can you tell us about, kind of take us back to this time period and help us understand what sort of imperial things were actually happening, that people were scared of happening, that help us understand sort of the environment in which the Espionage Act begins to be discussed?
Sure. So, the funny thing about the Espionage Act is that it's passed in 1917, and it's also an update in some of the clauses I care most about, which are about keeping information secret from foreign spies. Those clauses in the 1917 Act are basically updated versions of a 1911 Act, the Defense Secrets Act. And the Defense Secrets Act in 1911 is the first time in US history there's a peacetime spying law. And so the question that really struck me as I began working on the book is why, the US has been around since the late 18th century. It's gone over a century without a peacetime spying law. And then in the early 20th century, you get not one, but two efforts to pass these laws. And they're passed, really with a sense of urgency that this is a major problem, that we need to have peacetime spying laws. The 1911 law is passed with basically no congressional debate whatsoever. And, I was trying to work out why this happened, why the newfound need for spying laws, because obviously spying isn't a new thing. There have been spies throughout human history. And the answer I hit upon was really that it's tied up with a kind of new era of imperial conflict, not just between the great powers and kind of concerns that in a kind of age of geopolitical confrontation and new technologies like the telegraph and the steamship and the camera, which will allow information to circulate, all of which kind of raises the value of information, and therefore leads to both new efforts to find out what other nations are doing and planning, but also to protect one's own information. But also tied to a series of anxieties really about maintaining the hierarchies of empire. And so in the US case, the main sort of advocate for a new regime of secrecy is a congressman from Alabama. His name is Richmond Hobson. He's a kind of character I knew very little about, but he's really giving speeches all throughout the early part of the lead up to the 1911 law, talking about the fact that there's a war coming with Japan imminently in the Pacific, and that Hawaii and the Philippines and the west coast of the United States are overrun with Japanese spies. And, this is a kind of moral panic and anxiety about the racial other and anxiety about maintaining newly won imperial holdings in the Pacific. And it looks very similar to things that are happening in the other empires. I mean, this is the era, obviously, of the Dreyfus Affair in France, and in the United Kingdom, there's a whole series of sort of new spy fiction published, beating up a kind of panic about, well, first French spies, but then after the geopolitics shift, German spies. And these sort of anxieties will run through up until the First World War, and they intermingle geopolitical, sort of inter-imperial conflict, but also the fears of decolonization. And sort of nascent decolonization. There's an example I like very much that in the early years of World War I, the British and the American security services kind of joined together to arrest and charge a bunch of Indian anti-colonial activists on the west coast of the United States who were actually trying to meet with the German Foreign Service to run guns back to India to kind of lead a national independence uprising. So you see here some real kind of politics happening, but that then gets layered on top of it, a kind of moral panic and a fear. In the US, it's called the Hindu conspiracy trial, although, most of the participants are actually Sikh, not Hindu. And that intermingling of geopolitical fears, racial anxieties, and an effort to secure what really is hard to keep secure, right? I mean, a few small nations dominating the globe's territory, I think, leads to a moral panic, which then creates these new laws.
So you mentioned that there are particular clauses in the law that you are paying most attention to. Before we get into kind of what happens when this starts to, when this is a law and starts to actually get put into practice, can you walk us through sort of what you're focusing on and why these bits?
Sure. So the Espionage Act of 1917 is really a kind of omnibus national defense or national security bill, and it has a whole host of different clauses. The one that's most important during World War I, and the one that's maybe most important to the history of the First Amendment, and the one that's most familiar to American historians, are clauses that are intended to prevent interfering with the draft and make it illegal to sort of criticize the war if that will interfere with the draft. But the clauses that are at the center of my story, and that are at the center of the Espionage Act after World War II and into the present, are two sections relating to the handling of information. And these are the sections that have been transferred in from that 1911 Defense Secrets Act. And one of them covers what we might think of as traditional spying. It makes it illegal to give information to a foreign government. That today is Section 794 of the Espionage Act. But the second is actually a much broader and more confusing set of clauses, Section 793, which are really all information handling regulations. And they all take the same form. They basically make it illegal to do things with information relating to the national defense is the key phrase. such as retaining it without authorization, transferring it, or communicating it without authorization. And they're really information handling provisions that try to establish and regulate state secrecy.
Got it. That's good to know sort of where we're pinpointing in the discussion here. And interesting to think of this, given all those anxieties, coming in as a sort of omnibus bill in some ways that I found that a little bit counterintuitive. If you're so worried about this, why doesn't it have its own thing? But I guess there were kind of a lot of different things, as you said, all being sort of smushed together. What then happened with it? Why do you pinpoint, for example, the first 18 months after World War I as being an important turning point for this act?
Yeah, so during World War I, as a lot of people who study American history or the history of civil liberties know, the Espionage Act provides a kind of vehicle for widespread government censorship. 2,000 people are arrested, charged, 1,000 go to jail for criticizing the American war effort, primarily socialists, people on the left. And they're sent to jail for saying pretty innocuous things about the war, sort of saying this is a rich man's war and we don't think we should be fighting it. The most famous person to go to jail is probably Eugene Debs, the perennial socialist presidential candidate. And he's sentenced to jail for really a socialist stump speech in which he says, look at all my comrades who've gone to jail. How ridiculous is the US? It says it's fighting for liberal democracy, but you can't even say what you want in this country. And this is, I think, an important moment in the history of American democracy, because under the pressure of war, there's been a kind of rise of national security censorship, and an idea here that the government should be able to censor information that is speech that is seen to be harmful to the public good. And the panic that sort of rises during World War I doesn't end with the armistice in 1918. In 1919, there are a series of bombings organized primarily by anarchist movements. This is an era after World War I fame, where there's the revolution in the Soviet Union, but there's revolution in Mexico, there's revolution in Ireland, there's revolution in Germany, there's imperial unrest and protest in many places, there are racial pogroms in the United States. And so those panics continue. And in that context, it's a real question whether the kind of patriotic culture of censorship, the kind of our nation first, we need to censor the radicals, we need to censor the critics, whether that will continue and become a kind of more permanent regime. And in sort of early 1919, it looks like it's going to become permanent in peacetime. The Supreme Court hears for the first time a bunch of appeals from those World War I prosecutions, including the jailing of Debs. And it unanimously rules that that kind of censorship is compatible with the First Amendment, says it's okay to send people to jail for criticizing the war. Famously, Oliver Wendell Holmes says, you can't falsely shout fire in a crowded theater. You don't have the right to say that sort of thing. And he says that criticizing the war when the nation's at war is just like falsely shouting fire, and therefore you don't have the right to do it. And the Attorney General, Palmer, really positions himself also as a kind of national security demagogue, a kind of national security populist. Wilson, right, will have his stroke and be kind of sidelined. And Palmer is seen as the favorite for the 1920 presidential election. And he's running on a militant sort of law and order program about expelling radical immigrants, about passing permanent censorship, peacetime censorship laws, and making permanent what had begun during the war. But then in the sort of summer of 1919, a small group of civil liberties activists from the left of American politics really begin to push back on both of these developments. They begin to criticize and investigate Palmer and Palmer's raids, which is, when J. Edgar Hoover really gets his start. He's sort of picked up by Palmer to help orchestrate the arrest and mass deportation of immigrants who were suspected of being radicals. And they conduct investigations and find that there was malpractice in those raids, and they were not really legitimate exercises of national security, but were a type of abuse. And that really puts a dent in Palmer's presidential hopes, including, he famously predicts that there will be a revolution on May Day in the United States, and this makes him look like a sort of paranoid laughingstock. So his campaign to make permanent this regime falls apart because of political pushback. And interestingly, that same civil liberties activists, they put pressure on Oliver Wendell Holmes, who had written these unanimous decisions saying you don't have the right to criticize the war effort. and they sort of provide him with reading materials, and they make cases to him based on sort of John Stuart Mill and why you should have the right to criticize the government. And in the fall of 1919, in the Abrams decision, which is another Espionage Act case concerning the Sedition Act amendments to the Espionage Act, the majority of the judges just apply the decisions from the spring and say you don't have the right to kind of call for a general strike during war. But Oliver Wendell Holmes dissents from his own precedent only 6 months earlier and says, actually, you do have the right to say these sorts of things, and it's important to a democracy that we have a free marketplace of ideas. And that dissent in the fall of 1919 is really the birth of the modern First Amendment, and it will sort of expand thanks to activism by a whole host of civil liberties groups and press groups over the 20th century to produce our modern, very robust right to free speech. So I think that period after World War I, there's a real sort of potential turning point where the patriotic kind of culture of censorship and national security that had begun during the war could have continued. What instead happens is pushback by civil liberties groups helps kind of create a new space for free expression in American politics, really begins to blunt one part of the Espionage Act's provisions, those censorship provisions. But it leaves open a question of whether or not a national security bureaucracy can rely on the other sections, those sections concerning information security, and begin to keep information secret in the first place. And that also really begins in the fall of 1919 with the appointment of a young J. Edgar Hoover to head up the radical division of the Justice Department, from where he'll ultimately rise to become the director of the FBI.
No, thank you for taking us through those initial changes. I think turning points are always interesting, but especially one kind of right at the beginning of the Act itself, and with such consequences for not just the Espionage Act, but, as you said, the kind of First Amendment aspects of it more broadly. If we skip ahead a bit in time, I wonder if I can ask you to tell us a little bit about Harry Truman and the changes that he makes, and particularly comparing sort of what he and his government do around creating a secrecy system as compared to the one that is existing in this time we've just been talking about, 1917, 18, 19. What are some of the kind of key differences between them? To what extent would the US government consider Truman's to have been a success as opposed to maybe Wilson's failure?
Sure. So, as we talked about, the Espionage Act as it's proposed in 1917 is an omnibus bill. It has a whole host of clauses included within it. And one of them is a section that's going to give the president the authority to censor the press if the press publishes secret information. And this is incredibly controversial as the bill is debated in Congress in 1917 and is ultimately cut from the bill. And along with it, a few other clauses are cut as well, because basically Congress doesn't want to give the president unilateral authority to decide that something should be secret and to censor the press if they publish it. They think that's sort of not compatible with American democracy. The problem, though, is that in cutting those sections out of the bill, what Congress has done is really made the Espionage Act confusing. They've left a big hole in the middle of the law. And the reason for that is that what's left are a series of prohibitions in Section 793 and 794 that say you can't do things with information relating to the national defense unless you have authorization. But the Espionage Act neither defines what information relating to the national defense is, nor defines a process by which one might be authorized to access it or retain it or so forth. And the reason it doesn't define either of those things is that those powers had originally been vested in the president. The idea was supposed to be that the president could decide whether something is information relating to the national defense, or the president could decide who will have access and the sort of mechanisms by which individual people will be authorized to access information. And leaving those definitional pieces out of the law just creates a kind of legal problem that's going to haunt the Espionage Act for most of its life, but particularly for its first 3 decades, when you see a series of kind of bureaucratic and legal and judicial improvisations trying to make sense of what does information relating to national defense mean and how is one authorized to receive it? And the reason you need to resolve that is if those things are too vague, well, then maybe the law is unconstitutional or maybe it's not able to be applied in any particular sense. And the book covers this kind of long period of improvisation and there's kind of some interesting and strange cases that emerge in those years. But the result is that by World War II, sort of bureaucrats who want to keep information secret within the government realize that they need a kind of fix. They need some clear mechanism that will establish what is information relating to national defense and a process to make very clear how the president can sort of decide what that is and isn't. And that will lead ultimately to the passage under Harry Truman of Executive Order 10290 in 1951, which establishes the modern classification system. It's been tinkered with it a few times after 1951, but the basic architecture of the system is still in place today. And that's the system where there are a series of kind of categories of classified information: top secret, secret, confidential. And that those are determined by individual bureaucrats deciding what stamp any particular document should receive based on its potential risks to national security. And then there are a sequence of sort of executive orders to establish loyalty procedures and access procedures for how people get particular security clearances, allowing them to access different levels of information. And that's kind of the heart of the modern secrecy regime. And it's an executive order passed in 1951. From my point of view, what's interesting is that that's really a plug-in to the Espionage Act. It's really a kind of important patch that comes in to say, well, information relating to the national defense is covered by the Espionage Act. We don't know necessarily what information relating to the national defense is, but we definitely know that anything that is stamped classified under this classification order is information relating to the national defense. And I think there are some important sort of ironies here. That the first is that there was some concern that information relating to national defense was sort of too broad a category, but actually these classification orders allow people to stamp something as secret if it will relate to the national security, which at the time was understood to be even broader than national defense. So it's given sort of the executive branch huge authorities to stamp a lot of information as secret and then use that sort of the criminal prohibitions of the Espionage Act to give teeth to this bureaucratic sort of self-invention in the executive branch. And the second irony is that this is exactly the sort of thing that Woodrow Wilson's Congress had been unwilling to grant the president and had removed from the Espionage Act. And then, almost 4 decades later, Harry Truman takes exactly those powers by executive order, and there is very little protest. And we've lived with that system ever since, and we treat it as perfectly natural that a president should have such vast powers to declare information secret and prevent it from circulating to the public. And that executive order, as I said, has been tinkered with since. A lot of different presidents have put forward their own kind of adjustments to some of the sort of rules, but the basic architecture remains. And so between the sort of stitched together criminal prohibitions of the Espionage Act and the bureaucratic innovation of the executive order about classification, you then get a quite robust secrecy regime, one that I think gives more power to the president than even Woodrow Wilson's Congress was willing to imagine.
No, that second irony in particular speaks so directly to that point. Can I ask you to tell us about some of that tinkering that's happened since Truman's government, particularly around the second half of the 1970s, if you want to kind of pull out some of the most important or significant things that were changed around then?
Sure. So, from my point of view as a historian, you're sort of willing to forgive the Truman administration for creating a really far too deferential secrecy regime, too deferential to the presidency, one that really allows too much information to be kept secret. Because by the US government hasn't had a kind of secrecy regime really before this time. There's been some secrecy systems established in the armed forces, but this idea of a kind of government-wide massive bureaucratic process is new. It's passed during the anxieties of the Red Scare and when America's rising to becoming a genuine sort of global superpower for the first time. And so, the system turns out by the early 1950s to produce massive overclassification. Repeated studies by Defense Department groups find that, somewhere between 75 and 90% of information that's classified doesn't need to be classified. There are all sorts of bureaucratic incentives to put a secret stamp on something. And by the early 1970s, it's become very clear that that's not just a kind of bureaucratic problem, that it produces real deformations in American foreign policy and produces real abuse. And so, the Vietnam War is an obvious sort of form of that abuse. That so much of that policy is formed in secret and then kind of spun publicly in different ways. And so the Pentagon Papers release, famously reveals that kind of history of deceit. But then there's also all the abuse of the CIA and the FBI, mind control programs and CIA coups overseas and monitoring of anti-war movements, and the FBI's COINTELPRO programs, which intimidate and harass, a whole host of illegal acts to try to disrupt groups that they think are contrary to the American national security interest and so forth. And so in the 1970s, there's a kind of moment where you would have expected there would have been major reform of the system. The Church Committee looking into abuses in the intelligence community sort of famously says that abuse thrives in secrecy. So the surprising thing to me is how lackluster the secrecy reforms are of the 1970s. There are a couple that people, pay a lot of attention to. The one is the Freedom of Information Act, right, which is actually first passed in 1966 and then updated in 1974. And, that seems like a breakthrough for kind of transparency. But actually, from my point of view, the interesting thing is that America, for the first time, felt like it needed a freedom of information law. That's itself a reaction to how much new secrecy there is. But also, the act is incredibly weak when it comes to national security secrecy. There's an exemption that means that you can't FOIA national security information, that the government can just sort of say, well, if it falls under a classification, it's not covered by FOIA. So it's a kind of carve out for this secrecy regime. And then more broadly, the whole logic of FOIA actually presumes the government will keep a lot of secrets and then gives individual citizens the right to kind of pry out individual pieces of information. So, that's one kind of transparency reform that's very weak. The other is the Intelligence Oversight Committees established in Congress in the wake of the Year of Intelligence in 1975. But again, those don't really take on the secrecy regime. They just incorporate part of the legislature within the secrecy state, right? Allow particular members of Congress to learn the secrets that otherwise were circulating in the executive branch. So you get some reform, but from my point of view in this book, what's amazing is how tepid it is. It doesn't take on the classification system more broadly. It doesn't try to revise the Espionage Act. And then on the other side, you actually get a sequence of people who, from the conservative wing of the Republican Party, in the 1970s, who see these disclosures and the kind of legitimacy crisis of the security state. And they say that the lesson to be learned here is not that there is too little transparency, but actually there's been too much, right? That we need to make sure that we protect the kind of prerogatives of a strong executive branch to maintain America's national security. And there's a tight cluster of young Republicans in the Ford White House, right? I mean, this is a young Dick Cheney, who's chief of staff, a Donald Rumsfeld, who was chief of staff and Secretary of Defense, Brent Scowcroft, Antonin Scalia is in the School of Law. Sorry, is in the Antonin Scalia School of Law is at George Mason, where I teach. It's Antonin Scalia is in the Office of Legal Counsel. George H.W. Bush is will become CIA director in these years, and they're all committed, particularly Cheney, to ensuring that the president maintains its ability to act in secret. And so you then see, alongside weak reforms for transparency, you see proposals to strengthen the Espionage Act, to make it a stronger law, which those don't succeed. But a series of other laws are passed. So there's an Intelligence Identities Protection Act, which gives new powers to keep the identity of CIA agents covert. There are CIA reform bills to make the CIA more exempt from FOIA. There's the establishment of pre-publication review boards within the CIA, which allow the CIA to basically screen and censor any speech by former officers about information which include information relating to their work. And so you get a whole bunch of patches that come out that sort of layer on top of the secrecy regime that had existed since the Truman years. And so by the 1980s and 1990s, actually the ability of the president to keep information secret is stronger than ever before. It actually survives the scandals of the 1970s and survives Iran-Contra and survives the end of the Cold War very successfully.
So it's on that last point I'd like to ask you about, because I agree it is surprising that there isn't reform in the 70s, but especially with the end of the Cold War. That seems like kind of, in some ways, such an obvious moment for reform. So why wasn't it reformed, at various points, but especially then?
Yeah, so the general story here, I think, is just there's a lack of political will. the 1970s moment I find the most surprising. It seems like the most obvious moment, in the wake of Watergate and the scandals of Vietnam and the revelations. And there, the Democrats would have been the party most likely to lead a reform effort. But there's not a great appetite for it. I mean, the lesson I think they take from the 1972 election, when McGovern loses so badly to Nixon, is that it's not a viable strategy to flirt with the anti-war movement. And a lot of the Democrats will kind of skirt to the center to try to show national security sort of legitimacy. It also would have involved taking on some of the great sort of salad days of the post-war Democratic Party, right? A lot of the abuse of secrecy happens under Kennedy and LBJ. So there's no great appetite for it there. I think the other problem is that secrecy is really powerful at producing its own legitimacy. It's a very powerful claim in American politics to say, well, we have access to secret information that shows that there will be real harms to national security. That there are wolves at the door, and we can't risk tinkering with things, or there will be real harms. And I think that's powerful because America, can look around the world in the 1970s and the 1980s and see conflict in many places and see that it itself is relatively spared and is relatively prosperous, and there's anxiety that comes out of that position in the hierarchy. I think it understates how much damage a kind of adventurous foreign policy does, both globally, also in terms of American economic spending, and how much money there is available for kind of poverty programs, for instance. It's instead going to bloated military-industrial complex spending contracts, and it also understates the risks of blowback, which will become more apparent in 9/11. But there's just not really any effective political coalition that emerges that is willing to take on the sort of pieties of the need for secrecy. The closest that America has is in the 1990s. Daniel Patrick Moynihan heads a commission into government secrecy. And, he reports, which most people have reported, that the classification system produces too much classification and it's in need of major reform. And he proposes legislation to do that kind of reform that gets reported, gets bipartisan support in committee, but then goes absolutely nowhere. And I think the reason for that is that, in the 1990s is not an opportune moment for reform of classification, even though you might think it should be, given that the Cold War has ended. Because what would motivate people to do classification reform, to take on the risks of making more information transparent and to undermine claims by security hawks that you need to keep information secret to keep yourself safe, is a real visible example of the harms that secrecy produces. And that had happened in the 1970s, but there'd been no reform. It had happened in the 1980s, but there'd been no reform. In the 1990s, there's no big, great scandal that can be used. And Moynihan's not very effective as a kind of champion against the security state, because actually in the 1970s and early 1980s, he'd been an advocate for a kind of more robust and independent and secretive CIA. And he has a change of heart because of Reagan's foreign policy in the 1980s, but he doesn't have close connections to the kind of parts of American political culture, anti-war, kind of more left-wing groups that might have made for a useful alliance. And so what he produces is really a pretty sort of sterile and intellectual exercise that points out the problems with classification and explains it would be good to reform it, but there's no moral urgency behind that. And Moynihan himself is more of a public intellectual than a legislator. He's really much more effective at bringing attention to an issue throughout his career than he is at mobilizing a coalition to get change done. And so, this effort in the 1990s just withers on the vine. The secrecy laws live on through what looks now, in hindsight, like a period of optimism and peace and opportunity, and are still fully there when the 9/11 attacks happen.